Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm the president of Bay Area Skeptics and your host tonight. We're doing something a little different than we usually do on the Bay Area Skeptics Skep Talk. Our guests tonight are Wendy Zuckerman from the podcast Science Versus and Sebastian Major from the podcast Our Fake History. The byline for Science Versus is, and I quote, "Science Versus takes on fads, trends, and the opinionated mob to find out what's fact, what's not, and what's somewhere in between." This sounds right up our skeptical alley. Wendy Zuckerman created Science Versus in Australia for the Australian Broadcasting Company, the other ABC, after a career as a science journalist. Well, arguably, she's still a science journalist, but there you have it. She brought the program to the United States via Gimlet in 2016, and they are working on their 12th season as we speak. Canadian Sebastian Major is a former secondary school history and English teacher who started Our Fake History, whose subtitle is Historical Myths Relished and Ruined, in 2015. The byline for Our Fake History is a podcast about myths we think are history and history that might be hidden in myths. Awesome stories that really maybe happened. Among other awards, Our Fake History won the Best Educational Podcast Award at the 2018 People's Choice Podcast Awards. Sebastian is also a musician, and his band Dirty Church provides the music for the show. His most recent podcast was number 160. Now, I've been listening to both of these podcasts for many months now and enjoy them very much. They're very different in style and obviously in content. One focuses on history, one focuses on scientific analyses of current issues. But in content, both of them often deal with what scientific skeptics would refer to as extraordinary claims in Sagan's terms. And both of them apply, to my mind, very similar approaches to evaluating, in Wendy's terms, what's fact, what's not, and what's somewhere in between. So I've invited both of them here to talk about their programs and how they think about issues skeptics care a lot about, both the specific topics they discuss and also how they come to the conclusions about these topics. Sebastian is taking a break while you move your family and the program to Ottawa. So you posted a program I hadn't heard before. But I have to say, I was absolutely delighted to hear it. Now, a lot of listeners to the Bay Area Skeptics programs are from California, and a lot of us are, of course, from Northern California. My fake backdrop there is the view from the top of the Berkeley Hills of San Francisco Bay. And I was so pleased that about your discussion of the fake honorary society, E. Clampus Vitus, and especially your analysis of the Drake brass plate found in Marin County. You really had a lot of details that I didn't know about both the clampers and Drake's plate. And so that was really, really fun. And Wendy, I went back and listened to a show from May, How ASMR Hijacks the Brain. And my initial reaction was pseudoscience BS. ASMR, for all the rest of you who, like me, had never heard of this phenomenon before, it's a hugely popular fad of listening to people whisper to you while they do simple repetitive tasks. And what is it about towel folding that makes all this work? I don't know. ASMR stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response, which is totally meaningless gibberish. What is it? But I got to say, in watching this program, you interviewed real scholars, real researchers, real scientists who've been looking at this phenomenon, hitching up people to various machines and studying the tingling and all these other claims of ASMR. And I've been taking care of my 2-year-old grandchild for the last 5 months, 6 months, but who's counting? And I want you to know that at nap time, train whistle blowing makes a sleepy noise. So
we sing that to my kid too. That's like my kid's bedtime song as well. That's really struck a nerve there.
You try whispering it very quietly and see if it works. So let's talk a little bit about your podcast, which I obviously have enjoyed and gotten a great deal out of, and for practical reasons here. So guys, how do you decide what stories you want to cover? I mean, how do you choose a topic for a podcast? Ladies first. Wendy, how do you decide what you guys are going to do?
So there's like a 3-pronged test, I suppose. The first one is it important? And I guess it could be if you rank them all, like if it's like a pie and if the pie looks big enough at the end of the day. So some of the topics we cover, they're not important, but then the next question is it something about them that's really surprising? And then the final piece is, has it been widely covered? So if there's something important, was surprising once upon a time, but 1 million people covered it, we probably wouldn't do it. But if it sort of hits all of those boxes, that's something that we want to be doing. And during COVID, when we sort of retooled our whole podcast and started just reporting on, we did a whole season and we got a bigger team and we were reporting a lot more about COVID questions. What exactly rises to the level of something that we would spend 20 minutes to 30 minutes covering became super important, because you remember in the early days of COVID, it was just like this 10-headed hydra of misinformation, whether it was like drinking bleach or UV light or hydroxychloroquine, or it was just, but particularly at the beginning, you can get COVID 1 million times. We were all asymptomatic. Remember when we all thought we were asymptomatic? We still kind of do, but there was just so little known and so much guff on the internet. So every time something came up, we would have to be like, does Science Versus need to be covering this? Bleach, for example, not surprising. Important, yes. Do not take bleach in order to prevent COVID. So important, yes. Not surprising that perhaps you shouldn't be doing this. And it was covered in an instant by, good quality publications saying this is nonsense. So that is something we did not need to cover. But the one that was a little more debated was the lab leak theory. That came up around, and that came up again and again with the pandemic and this sort of thing. I'm really going through like COVID's greatest hits now.
You are indeed.
That was one that that had been covered. Super important. What caused this outbreak? It wasn't really that surprising to academics who knew about this. We're always having so many of the new viruses we have come from wildlife, but it wasn't really covered in a rigorous way, we didn't think. And at the time, there were even some very reputable news sites that I thought were misinterpreting the information and were basically saying it could be a lab leak, which I guess we could say for another day. But they were, I think, so that was why we were like, okay, yes, we're going to tackle that. Sebastian, I did a ramble. Go.
Those are extremely clear and useful parameters and make a lot of sense given. And I think you guys did fabulous work on COVID, and Joe Rogan as well, but maybe that'll come up later on. Sebastian, how do you decide what stories to cover?
What's nice for me is I feel like I'm not really acting in the public interest the way Wendy is. So I get to really kind of pursue my whims a little bit more on the show. So I'm always looking for a hook that has to do with some sort of myth or misconception in history that people have come to believe. So either we're starting from like a well-loved legend like King Arthur, and then exploring if there's a kernel of historical truth there, or we're going with something that people say all the time that they believe. Like, for instance, people will tell you with a straight face that the reason that the Sphinx has no nose is because Napoleon shot it off with his cannons. And that's just something people believe as a real historical fact, and it sounds like it could be true, right? Like it sounds truthy. And so on my show, I'll kind of start with one of those things and then unpack them, right? Let's have fun with the story. So my show is also really a storytelling show. And so what I try to do is, like, before we kind of pitch this yarn on the scrap heap, let's have our fun with it first. Like, let's enjoy the story, and then we'll do the historical detective work and pull it apart. One of the other things I think about all the time is the kind of stuff that other history-themed media is often covering. So this kind of goes to what Wendy was saying about what gets covered. Well, if you ever watch any, historically themed television, it's like World War II all the time. And I've studiously avoided the Second World War, not because it isn't interesting, not because it's not important, just because it's covered. And so I'm looking for stories that maybe people haven't heard, and also just stuff that's interesting to me. So sometimes I know I got to play the hits a little bit. So this past season I did, a 3-part series about misconceptions about the Titanic. And in the world of historical media, the Titanic is a hit. People know it, people recognize it right away, and they want to know more about it. But then
and the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar isn't.
That's right. There's another hit for you, right? But then sometimes I'm going to pursue something that I'm interested in. So, a few seasons back, I did a 3-episode series on a woman named Helena Blavatsky, who is, you're familiar with Blavatsky. So she was the founder of the Theosophical Society, and maybe one of the 19th century's greatest spiritual charlatans. But I'm sort of amazed and fascinated by her. And she's had a wild influence over all sorts of disparate movements in the 20th century. So, when I put up Helena Blavatsky, I know people are going to be like, what? I don't know about this. This seems obscure. As opposed to when I put up the Titanic, they're like, oh, I saw that movie. So I try to have a balance of both of those things.
That all makes plenty of sense. What is it? God, don't get old. You things don't come to the frontal lobe as fast as they ought to, and that drives me nuts. Yes, that's it. Waldorf schools, Theosophy. Good old Blavatsky was the founder of a major contributor to the Theosophical movement, which is actually the foundation for today's Waldorf schools, which are all over the country in the United States. And if you ever really look into they're very popular, because they have a lot of artistic stuff, except the kids draw the same thing. Everybody draws this. It's not exactly creative. And there's a number of things in these very popular public or private schools in the United States that really go back to some of these strange ideas from Theosophists. So I think Blavatsky was a great choice.
Oh yeah.
And actually, you are doing a public service more than you think.
Well, I mean, when everyone from the New Age hippie movements of the 1960s to the Nazis can trace their philosophical roots back to the same person, that kind of blows your mind a little bit. So worth exploring.
Yeah, and if you're on the same side as the Nazis, you need to get a different side.
Famously.
But I digress. So, is there a difference in how you present a story depending on the content or the topic that you have decided upon? Wendy, does what you are talking about change how you actually present it?
Hugely. Yes. In the most kind of obvious way, I think, depending on the seriousness of the topic and whether we can have a laugh about it and who we're laughing at are big questions that we have to constantly be asking ourselves. We love to joke on the phone, like on the podcast, and we have this like very nerdy internal theme that we take science seriously, but we don't take ourselves seriously. So we want to be laughing all the time, but sometimes it's just not appropriate, obviously. So that's a lot of it, is like, how can we be telling a story in like a really engaging way that feels appropriate to what we're covering. But I think there's also questions around how we use anecdotes and where they're important. And for us, like, an anecdote would just be a character who's experienced something. ASMR, the person who entered. We opened our story with someone who does ASMR on YouTube and has experienced it himself. And told a story about how lovely it was when he heard it the first time. And that's a pretty, we're not breaking any ground with our podcast starting with an ASMR person, and so that is an example where you're just like, well, we need to explain to the audience what the hell this thing is if they haven't experienced it. And plus, this guy is actually in the sort of fatty world as well, because he makes these YouTube videos. So perfect. But when you're reporting on a medical issue or a medical health issue, we have to be so much more careful about, do we want to tell the story of, someone who had COVID, took ivermectin and got better? That's, which is lots of people, because lots of people just get better from COVID, regardless of what they take. And so obviously that's an anecdote that we would not want to be sharing on the show. Two very obvious examples, but as we've been making this show for 5-6 years, there's a lot of gray area in between where we're like, what is this character telling us? How important is this? Will this stay in the listener's mind when we actually don't want them to be thinking about that? So those are just some of the ways that we're constantly wondering, like, are we telling this story exactly how it should be told?
Sebastian, is there a difference in how you would present the material depending on the topic?
Actually, remarkably similar, right? The question of, can I have fun with this? And, I like the show to have a sense of humor. And so, I try to put that into a lot of what I do. But there are some stories where it's completely inappropriate. And especially if you're telling a story that is from outside your own culture, right? And so, just this past season, I did a 3-part series on the Benin bronzes. Yeah. And they've been in the news again, because
they're back in the news. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Many museums around the world have been returning their bronzes to Nigeria. And the story of how those bronzes ended up in the hands of the British is one of the more sort of dark and upsetting stories you can find in the annals of colonialism, of which there are many. And so telling that story, I had to be really thoughtful, really careful, knowing that, if I did it wrong, not only would I run the risk of, not doing justice to what happened to folks who live in Nigeria, but also not doing justice to, British people as well. So you just had to be very careful about reporting the facts as they've been documented by historians and what appears in the primary sources. And when you do that, then very few people can kind of come back at you and be angry, because you're like, here is what is in the record. And I believe
Don't
when you look at, pardon me?
Don't shoot the messenger.
Right. However, if I approached that topic with a lot of, snark, it would be completely inappropriate. And also any sort of learning that could happen from that would be gone, because I would immediately sort of be destroying any of my own credibility to be able to tell that story. So it's something I think about a lot as well.
That makes plenty of sense to me. Wendy, there's an Australian podcaster, though now that I think about it, it's possible he might be a Kiwi. And he has a program called Stuff the British Stole.
I was just Mark Fennell.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's Australian. He's Australian.
Yes, Aussie, yeah. He also did a piece on the Benin bronzes, and covered some of the same material, different style, different approach, but again, being respectful to actually both sides. It's a fun podcast, by the way, for those of you who like listening to podcasts. There's a third podcast for you to add in addition to both of these two.
I love that show, and I definitely listened to that before I sort of embarked on my own. And if anything, it just made me want to dig deeper into that story, because what he creates are these sort of more bite-sized half an hour podcasts. And so I was like, all right, I'm ready to dive deeper into this story, because there's a lot more to be said.
And you do, and you take more time on this. So and that's great. That's a feature. Do you have a favorite episode? I mean, you've both done zillions of episodes by now after your almost the same length of time thing. You started in 2015 also, didn't you, Wendy, or early 2016? Yeah. So you guys have been churning stuff out for quite a while. It may be like children, it's too hard to choose.
You can pick. Both children, I imagine, and podcasts.
Do you have a favorite child?
I do. I was really proud of our ivermectin episode, because I thought that one actually was born out of our Joe Rogan fact-checking mission. And what I found really fascinating about that, I had sort of, like a lot of people, it kind of rolled over me as another Hydra head.
Sorry, that's my ringtone. Nobody ever called me.
I was like, please tell me you're being attacked by a bird right now.
But actually, I chose it because it sounds a little bit like a gibbon, but I apologize for that.
I can see.
Please. Ivermectin and Joe Rogan, yes.
Yes. And so the story of ivermectin had sort of crossed, obviously my eyes and ears on Twitter mostly, I guess, of people being like, horse tranquilizer. But to actually dive into the story, I realized it was so much more complicated. And ultimately, I think another study's coming out. It is either already out or it's about to come out, again, showing that ivermectin does not work. We're getting more and more of these good quality studies now. But what was super interesting was at the time when people were getting really snarky, as Sebastian puts it, about ivermectin, I think a lot of the data wasn't in, actually. Which is to say, it's not in on either side, of course. But what was interesting was to see how politicized it got so quickly when neither side really had backing. Then in the end, it turned out that it does not seem to be effective. But that was a really interesting story. Also, the fact that there was some very incredible, alleged fraud, let's say, was a real surprise. So anyway, so that the twists and turns of that story I really loved. And then for different reasons, I loved this episode we did about. It was a format breaker for Science Versus, but it was called like a seedy adventure, I think is what we ended up calling it. And it was about one of the longest running experiments in the world, where I won't tell you all the details, but basically some researchers more than 100 years ago put some seeds in a glass bottle and then hid it on a campus in the United States, where the researchers know where it is, but no one else does. It's a secret. And every decade or so, they pull up a new bottle and then see whether the seeds are still active. And it was just so much fun to report. The researchers who were part of this 100-year-old experiment were so excited about their work. It was like the stakes were, was high enough, but it was like, I think we reported it in the middle of COVID. I don't know. It was just I think we were probably in like the second year of basic lockdown, and just the joy of reporting the wonders of science was really fun.
Yeah, that's great. Sebastian, what's your favorite child?
Oh, it's really hard to choose. When I think back, yeah. I feel like my favorites don't have so much to do with, again, doing something really important to helping the like public discourse the way Wendy was doing. When I think of my favorites, are just ones that interested me the most. So, a few seasons back, I looked at the question of who invented rock and roll and what was the first rock and roll song. And, I'm kind of busting the myth that like rock and roll begins with Elvis. Right. And that is still everyone kind of knows that's not true now, but it's still this pervasive idea. Even Rolling Stone magazine places like year one of rock and roll in 1954 when Elvis records his first song at Sun Studios. And it's truly a preposterous claim. But then when you try to break down, okay, what really is the first rock and roll song? It gets really, really hard to put your finger on it. And one author, and I'm forgetting the name of the author right now, so forgive me, but he once said that finding the first rock and roll song is like looking at the color spectrum and trying to find the spot where indigo becomes purple, right? And everyone's going to kind of put their finger on a different spot. So what I ended up doing is finding all this really great music from the late 40s, some of it going back to, the 1930s, all of which could potentially be the first rock and roll song. And then I kind of say, here's the color spectrum, find the spot where indigo becomes purple. So I really love those. And also I got to play music on those shows and talk about sort of what musically makes something rock and roll. So, as a musician and a music fan, it's one that I really love. But then, last season, I did a 3-part series on the War of 1812. And for Canadians, this is this real important part of our own national mythos, because it was the war where we beat America. And Americans do not see it that way. And so I really wanted to
just a police thing?
Yeah. Anyway, it was fun to get into because, I had to not only challenge sort of, these sort of well-loved American tropes about the war, but also these Canadian myths that, we needed to let go of. And so I kind of got to evaluate my own identity in a way there. And so why do I love those ones? Mostly because they were kind of personal for me.
Yeah. They totally defendable. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, this is sort of the inverse of that. Are there any topics or subjects that you categorically would not cover, that you just would rule out, that we don't go there for some reason or another? And if so, why? Wendy?
No, we cover everything. Nothing's off the table. In season 1 in America, I did one season in Australia and then was in America. I think season 1 we did gun control right off the bat, which sort of, I guess, in 2016. Now every man and his dog's done gun control, but back then I think the head of Gimlet was worried for me. I live to tell the tale, but so no, I think what Sebastian was saying before about how when you stick to the facts, you can really cover. It makes me feel very confident about covering anything. We've talked about abortion in detail, in the details of what happens, but also what are the real risks, what not, what do people not have to worry about. And you can take this to a level that other, I think, places can't, when you're like, I'm just talking about science. I'm just talking about anatomy, basic anatomy in some cases. And so, we've done the G-spot and really been like, this is what the clitoris looks like. This is how big it is. Again, that was several years ago when I think now people, there's like,
and it's not located in the throat.
Exactly. It's just anatomy. Exactly. It's just science.
Yeah.
And so
what about religion? What about religion?
I mean, if it made sense to cover it, we would. I don't know, like, because we try and look at the evidence of things, and we have thought, like, would we want to do could the plagues have happened? What really might the sort of plagues of Egypt been? It's almost Sebastian's turf, because I feel like that's kind of, I've heard stories of like maybe there was something happened and then that's why the river went red and then the fish tried to eat the things in the river and that's why then they all died and it was just like this. So I think we would cover anything like that. I'm not too worried about offending people.
But not so much religion per se, but religion as it relates to science or claims of from religion as they could be tested by science, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing just as I just jumped on this call. We're doing an episode about human composting, which the idea of just do a dinner with the food scraps, except doing it with people. And the Catholic Church has said they think it's desecrating the body. We're not getting into that. Of course, embalming, where you just shove formaldehyde into someone's blood, and the blood spurts out, and you get formaldehyde in you. Not desecrating the body, but so it's not the space of science versus to go into a deep analysis of what is desecration, but it is the space of science versus to be like, what is human composting really? What does it look like? Is it safe? These sorts of things. So I think as long as we wouldn't just like say what you believe in is stupid, because that's not for anyone. And what do I know? I'm not God.
It's kind of hard to demonstrate scientifically anyway.
Exactly. So I don't like just kicking a beehive for no reason. But if it fits those categories of important, surprising, sure, why not?
All right. Sebastian, are there topics that you would categorically not consider?
Yeah, well, religious topics are the ones that are always the most tricky, but they tend to be the most popular. So I have done sort of religion adjacent topics. I did a whole series on the question of, is the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia? And, obviously that's an important question to Jewish folks and a really important question to
Isn't it in Hollywood? Isn't it in like a warehouse in Hollywood somewhere?
Yeah, or is it? Yeah, but like that's a question that's not only important to Jewish folks, but also really important to Orthodox Ethiopian Christians, and deeply central to their identity. Now, what I found is when I put that out, I found I had this Ethiopian audience I didn't even know about. And that became one of my most popular episodes because it made the rounds on Ethiopian Twitter. And so, but it was one where you had to be like, okay, I need to be careful with this because again, this is not my tradition. And I left room for faith in the end. At the end of that story, I was like, here's I tried to do a responsible sort of look at where these stories come from and what texts they first appear in and when we think those texts were written. And then put that in the context of Ethiopian and Middle Eastern history or North African history more generally. And I think at the end, it does sort of lead you to a conclusion, but then I left some room for faith. Now, what's interesting is that I didn't get anything nasty back from my more religious listeners. It was actually my more skeptical, atheistic listeners who were like, I can't believe you left the door open for faith. Like, come on, man. I thought you were a little bit more hard-nosed than that. And I understand that perspective. And I think if you listen close to the episode, you would sort of see that the facts were there for everyone to draw a thoughtful conclusion. But at the end of the day, I talked about, this person in northern Ethiopia whose job it is to guard that ark. And when you take on that job, you give up your name. You're already a priest in the priesthood, but you give up your name. And now you are only just the guardian of the ark. And you have a very specific place that you need to live. And you have a specific food that you need to eat. And you have specific guidelines around which you must live your life. And so at the end of the episode, I was just like, I'm not going to tell that guy that the ark isn't real, right? So that was how I kind of got us there. But I will tell you this. There's two big fat topics that I'm terrified of. One is, was there a real Jesus? And the other is, what should we believe about Muhammad?
Yeah.
And
especially that latter one.
Yeah, well, but you know what?
Tread lightly.
Exactly. Both of them, because I will not make anyone happy. Yeah. I will not make anyone happy with a very careful historical dissection of those questions. And so I have steered clear of those. And so as much as I'm willing to talk about religion, it's more when you kind of like put the big figures right in the middle of your crosshair that you're sort of, as Wendy said, kicking the beehive.
Well,
And,
plus, you've only
that.
got an hour or whatever to talk about this. The nature of Jesus, for example, was, did Jesus actually live? I mean, there are shelves of books in theology libraries dealing with this topic. There's no way you could deal with it in an hour anyway, right?
Sure.
Back in the 2000s or so, I was invited to speak for a couple of conferences from an organization called the Jesus Seminar. And these are serious Christians whose basic position is that Jesus was not a historical character. But that doesn't mean that what he said, what somebody said or what came attributed to him weren't some pretty good ideas. And so let's focus on those. And these guys have been kicked up one side and down another by other Christians who really feel that a great deal is lost. I'm a humanist myself, so I don't have a dog in this fight at all, one way or the other. But I totally can appreciate your point of view. When I was at the National Center for Science Education, I did not get involved in the validity of religion issues at all. It was distracting from my message. But yes, those are splendid answers, my friends.
And I'll hit you with this real quick. And I know there's a lot we want to talk about, but I have received emails from rabbinical students that are fans of the show that want to go like, hey, you've talked about, whether or not we can believe the truth of the Torah. Here is essentially my latest term paper for rabbinical school on why we should. And you're like, whoa, I'm not quite qualified to debate with a rabbi on this, And so that's the other thing. When you court that stuff, be ready for the rabbinical school term papers. They're coming.
Which you probably don't have time to read. You're a busy guy. Anyway, yes. Well, speaking of commentary, both of you are on social media regarding your podcast. Both of you get comments from social media about your podcast. What have you learned from that sort of feedback? Have you learned anything useful?
Deep sigh. I find it very difficult because I am not the first person to say this, and I will not be the last. Twitter is, I'm not on Instagram. I'm not really on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter like this, like squinting, I'll like promote the show and then say, oh, that was a nice thing someone read. But it's an angry space. It's an angry space that you get love or hate, and very rarely will someone be like, here's a nuanced point about why blah, blah, blah. It's just not the format for that. So I would say sometimes get very, very lovely feedback that gives me a big smile. During the Joe Rogan stuff, got some not so nice feedback that made me realize that, there's a bunch of bozos out there. Oh, not that I didn't know already. But I will say, but away from Twitter and social media, we do get very thoughtful emails. And we have on the odd occasion changed our scripts when, people will say, oh, I think, this paper, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And most of the time we'll be like, yes, we read that paper and this is why we didn't include it. Or yes, the citation is there, but the episode was about something slightly different, so we didn't want to dive into the details on it. But there have been times where we're like, you know what, our wording was probably not precise enough. Let's switch it up. And then we'll tell them, thank you so much. So while there is a lot of, I can't be completely eyes closed, because there's been enough times where we get quite thoughtful feedback where if we don't feel like we need to change the script, at least I feel like I'm learning how to make a better show.
That's worthwhile. What about you, Sebastian?
Yeah,
I mean,
I don't
you
know
have
if I
different
get it.
clientele. You know,
I
for
mean,
one thing.
here's the thing. Most people who engage with me on social media are like super nice and
Mhm.
are just saying like, I just found your show and I love it, right? Like I get a lot of like, I just found your show messages. And it's often really nice. Usually when people want to get into it, they want to quibble. I mean, rarely have they done the same amount of research into the topic that I've done. And so it's never like an expert on the topic who is like annoyed that I've done a disservice to it. That like never happens. Instead, it's usually someone who's upset that I mispronounced their hometown's name, which I do all the time. And so that's a lot of it. But here's the thing. I will sometimes get things, but when I'll mispronounce something, I have gotten some very strident emails from folks saying that, that carelessness is, a just emblematic of,
Indication.
yeah, or it's emblematic of my privilege, and and perhaps my entire project is then tainted with sort of a white supremacist ideology. I've heard that, and then when I come back and go like, hey, that is not at all what I'm trying to do here. Let me be a bit more careful with how I do this. And before I did that Benin Bronze's show, I was like, coming into this, I just want to say, like, I'm going to do my utmost to engage with people from Nigeria and other parts of West Africa who want to sort of help me with this process. But then, I got it from other dinks online that are like, oh, you're so woke. Look at you. Right. And so it's like, oh, man. So, but here's the thing. I found that I find most people are pretty understanding, and that those voices don't really reflect the vast majority of people that are enjoying my show. And, maybe if I'm getting it from both of those angles, that means I'm finding some sort of balance. Maybe I'm trying to do what's right and what's responsible and what's thoughtful. Trying.
Well, I think
in episode 1 in the season in Australia, I had a joke where I pronounced Arkansas, Arkansas. Look, it's a dated joke, but this was 6 years ago, and the amount of comments for years after, mostly very like, by the way, just so you know. And I was like, come on, you think I don't know how to pronounce it? So that you just can't win sometimes.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's Mokalumni.
Mokalumni. Yeah, no, I couldn't do it.
You did fine. And just be glad you didn't have to pronounce Tuolumni.
Yeah.
That's another one.
Yeah, no,
Okay,
it was. I got nailed by the folks in Michigan for Mackinac Island, which is
I'm
spelled
Milwaukee,
Mackinac. But language is just symbols.
Yeah,
Hey.
My favorite one. I think I needed to do. I don't even remember. Is it Western Australia or something? Anyway, it's Cockburn, but they were like, no, it's Coburn, and I'm
Coburn,
like, dude,
yeah.
it's Cockburn. Like,
Cockburn.
I'm like, take some
Sounds like
puritanical
more.
pronunciations out of my face.
All right. Well, hopefully our viewers have gotten an idea about your podcast. And I'd really like now to switch it around a little bit and talk more about the backstage of what you guys do. The 10,000-foot views, so to speak, that really is not as obvious as the kind of things we're talking about. And this is mostly for selfish reasons, quite honestly, which this whole program is for selfish reasons. This is because this is something I wanted to do, and I get to choose the speakers. So there. Because I think there's a lot of overlap between what good historians do and good scientists do in terms of how they think about issues and how they go about answering questions. And let me just try to give us a little bit of a starting point. You're totally welcome to disagree with me completely and tell me I'm off the wall. But let me just tell you a little bit where I'm coming from. If we're all kind of semi in the same direction, then we'll have a further conversation about details. And if I'm off in the wilderness wandering around by myself, you can slap me around and we can talk about what's more important. But my background, I was a nonprofit manager before I retired. I worked at a little small, if grandly named, nonprofit called the National Center for Science Education. We dealt with the creation and evolution issue. So a big chunk of my job was trying to help people understand not just the science of evolution, but also science. Also, science is a way of knowing the epistemological issues, if you will, but science is a way of knowing. And so I got a lot of experience trying to, well, I've always, even when I was a college professor, I was always interested in the public understanding of science. And there's a huge literature on this and tons of survey data, a tiny bit of which I've contributed to. And in general, what stands out, like with the science and engineering indicators that is conducted every 2 years, they ask a whole bunch of questions about science, but also some questions about the methodology that scientists use. And they have a theoretical. You have a blood pressure medicine, you want to know if it works. Do you give it to 1,000 people and see what happens? Or do you give it to 500 people and you don't give it to another 500 people and see what happens? Now, the utterly dismal part of this whole result is that fewer than half of Americans know that that second design is the one you should try. The idea that science is experimentation, that science is testing of ideas, is something that is not well understood in the American public. So I ended up over the years with this really boiled down philosophy of science, as it were. I really skipped all the stuff about, the various flavors of falsification and the demarcation issue and all that kind of stuff. If people don't know that science is about testing, that's what you need to talk about. And what is, so science, basically, the way I would present it to the general public is that it's a method of coming up with testing explanations about the natural world, and testing and natural are the two components. You can't test explanations or statements about the supernatural because you can't test them. And testing, because of the nature of testing is holding constant some variables. If there is a supernatural, if there are gods or ancestor spirits or pixies or fairies or anything like that, by definition, they are not constrained by human activity. So you can't hold their efforts constant. So therefore, you can't test supernatural explanations. You just leave God out of it and just stick with natural causes. And that was a big, part of my message, in course, in dealing with the creation and evolution issue. But still, the kernel of that, I think, is applicable across the board. By the way, I would tend to use the word testing rather than experiment, because, as you know, it's not what you say, it's what they hear. And when people hear the word experiment, what they hear, what they visualize is somebody sitting at a bench with a white coat, pouring something from one beaker to another. They think, laboratory, direct experimental control and so forth. And they don't realize that some guy sitting at a duck blind can also be conducting an experiment, depending on, the variables that are being controlled. You can control variables using statistics and computer simulations and models and stuff like that. So testing, to me, is a better term than experiment. But the big idea is you control for some variables, and you see, after having done that, whether your explanation still holds. That's kind of the bottom line. None of you, ran out of the room screaming. So I'm assuming that that's not too bad. I mean, we can sort of start with that very basic idea. Thank you. So now we're going to go into history, about which I know hardly anything. But I want you to know, Sebastian, that I did do some reading on philosophy of history, because I knew nothing about it before deciding to do this podcast. I love history, I read it, but that's not the same thing as actually understanding the undercarriage, as it were, and understanding the structure of this discipline. And it is a discipline, and there's a huge literature, and I didn't even ruffle the surface slightly. But in general, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have that right, history deals with episodic events and past periods of time. Historians are interested in what, in terms of what happened. They're interested in the why. They're interested in the how, what are the processes behind an event or period. And much of the time, historians are concerned about what does it mean, which is not something that's, what does it mean in terms of us today and understanding the human condition, et cetera, et cetera. Unlike scientists, historians are not trying to come up with predictive models or general laws. I don't think historians today are talking about the great man theory or any other sort of overarching explanations of past time. Roughly in the ballpark, again, from the 10,000 foot level, not from any sort of granular level at all.
Sure. Yeah. No, you're
okay.
Sounds like history.
Good. So, yeah, and of course, science is trying to predict. I mean, we do want to come up with generalizations. We call them theories. We're come up with generalizations that allow us to bring a variety of observations under a single rule, if you will, or explanation. And that allows us to make some statements about what will happen. Historians are by and large not really trying to predict something. That's kind of hard to do. Too many variables that we have so much more to learn.
You do see nowadays some historians sort of talking about civil war in the United States and sort of unpicking the factors that lead to civil war elsewhere and whether we're seeing those today. I am not equipped to discuss whether they are accurate in any way, shape, or form. But in those ways, sometimes I do see historians trying to predict the future.
Well,
go ahead.
I'll say this, that, anytime someone writes a new piece of history, if you read the introduction, the question they're trying to answer there is, why now? Why am I looking at this moment in the past now? And if you read something that's created today, it's going to reflect our current global political situation. And depending what country the historian's from, I mean, if you were reading an American historian, I guarantee you that in their introduction, they're going to hint at the current political situation in the United States and being like, I'm looking at the French Revolution, I'm looking at the Civil War, because perhaps there is something we can learn from this moment in the past. It's interesting, when I go back and read books from the early aughts, I shouldn't be surprised by it now, but in the introductions, everyone is always sort of winking at 9/11. Like, maybe my history is kind of about why 9/11 happened, even no matter what they're talking about, right? No matter how far distant in the past they're discussing. So one thing that historians do, if not predicting the future, they are often looking for parallels. And
this is the what does it mean aspect of it.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
This is how can we look at the past to understand what's going on today better? Which is not the same thing as saying, great universal sweeping laws like great man or something like that. So
yeah, no, and a lot of that sort of stuff has been sort of tossed out the window. But again, every generation sort of has its sort of theory du jour that sort of pops up. And even if the historian themselves doesn't necessarily subscribe to it, they feel like they need to sort of at least speak to it. So, I mean, I love going back and reading the stuff that was written like at the turn of the century, because it's not always the best history in terms of being reliable for the facts, but it gives you an incredible insight into the ideologies that were functioning at the time. Yeah. So I remember I got this one book that was about the Vikings. It was about the Viking Age, and it was written around the year 1900. And in the introduction, it's all about the glory of the British Empire. And it's all about, like, if you've ever wondered why the British are just such naturally great leaders and seafarers, look only to the Vikings. Right. And so, does that really teach me something in 2022 about the Vikings? Certainly not. It tells me a lot about how people in Britain, at least the educated class in Britain, perceived themselves in the year 1900.
Well, it's like reading the Shakespearean histories. You're not going to learn anything useful about Richard III. But reading the Shakespearean plays in general will tell you a lot about what Elizabethans were thinking about.
Very much.
What was going, but you're not going to really find out a lot. Although he did mention in Richard III, he's got Richard as a hunchback, and then of course the wonderful thing that happened when they actually found the skeleton of Richard III in the parking lot, he did have scoliosis, so that was pretty cool. But
yeah, well, and if I can add to that, so history as a discipline has evolved over quite literally thousands of years, and the first historian that often gets pointed to in the Western canon is a Greek named Herodotus. I'm sure maybe you've heard of Herodotus, but Herodotus sometimes gets called the father of history, but his other nickname is the father of lies.
Yes.
Because Herodotus was also a storyteller, right? Like he kind of comes at this spot where I'm trying to sort of explain to you how the world got to this point, but also I'm here to tell a good campfire story. And so like I will sort of fudge the details. So for a long time, you know, Herodotus went in and out of vogue where you'd go like, okay, oh, Herodotus is this great master from the earliest times of history. We must respect Herodotus. And then around the time of the Enlightenment, people were like, no, you can't believe anything this guy says. Herodotus is junk. You know, it's, you know, read it for fun, maybe, but don't read it for history. Oddly enough, like your skeleton of Richard III, now we've kind of come full circle on Herodotus and discovered that a lot of the stuff we thought he was lying about has since been confirmed by modern archaeology. Now, that doesn't completely exonerate Herodotus, and it's like everything in Herodotus is now just like bona fide 100%, but it's like he's not lying as much as you think he would be lying, given the kind of wildness of what's in his history. So, I mean, this kind of brings us to a broader question, which is, you know, in the world of history, how do you determine truth?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
When everything, absolutely everything, even primary source documents, even documents that we think of as sort of like boring pieces of accounting, when even they are sort of coded in the biases of the people that created them, how do we then sift truth from that? And there is no one
That gets us into the next topic,
Yeah,
which is
let's do it.
exactly where I wanted to go. You are prescient, my friend. Like I say, I think that there's a lot of parallel between what good historians do and what good scientists do in terms of actually the nitty-gritty of how they come to their conclusions. You have to find information. And of course, this is a huge category, right, in and of itself. How do you identify sources? How do you evaluate sources to know whether this is a good source? Primary versus secondary documents in history, for example. The same thing exists in science, too. I mean, you go back to the primary literature, which tells you one thing. The journalistic reports of that primary literature can kind of take you off into a direction you don't necessarily want to go.
Even review papers that have looked at a study and sometimes get it wrong, and you're like, what? What happened here?
Yeah, there's parallels there. And good scientists and good historians will kind of, I think, have the same sort of hygiene when they're performing this task of finding out information. You have to evaluate the information that you acquire. And again, this is a huge universe of practices itself. Testing of information, my favorite testing. Testing explanations against one another. The example of Herodotus that you mentioned, or any number of other historical claims, when you can actually find physical evidence of something that is in a text, that gives you a great deal more confidence in that text, and maybe in other things in that text as well. But you still want to, evaluate that with the cross-checking and the usual kinds of things that historians do. Third step is generalizing and inferring from those evaluations, as it were, the conclusions about the particular topic you're interested in. I'm being very sketchy here on details, but hopefully listeners can sort of fill in examples of their own. And then the last, which you both have dealt with in discussing your podcasts, rinse and repeat. The importance of revision of your conclusions when you get new information, when there's a new way of looking at information in the case of science or history, really. There are new techniques that allow you to reconsider what your conclusions were previously. And so that kind of iterative nature of science and history, I think, especially underscore the idea that science and history really have a lot in common as intellectual pursuits. And one might, I think, reasonably argue that finding information, evaluating it, generalizing and inferring from it, and then revising is the nature of sound scholarship, not just in science and history, but in in any scholarly endeavor. And that's another philosophical point as well. So, and here's the complimentary part. When I listen to your podcasts, I think I see those 4 steps very clearly reflected. I think both of you do a very good job of thinking about your information sources and evaluating the information that comes from them. You do a very good job of generalizing and inferring your conclusions from it. And we've seen examples of how you're perfectly willing to go back and say, we were wrong, or we need to make this more nuanced. We need to do this, that, or the other. So if we could maybe talk a little bit, we've had so much fun here. We don't have a whole lot of time, but let's talk a little bit about those steps as much as we can. How do you evaluate when you're out looking for information on ivermectin or on Drake's plate, or pick an example that you're interested, that you want to talk about from your canon? How do you evaluate the information that you come across so that you know what information to use and what information you want to just pass by? Wendy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and just maybe going over some of the ground that Sebastian and Eugenie touched on, is the biases that we see in historical documents. We also 100% see them in scientific studies, tests. Particularly there's very famous examples when we look at race science, from the 19th century, all those brains that were supposedly so different. When you look at sex and gender science, going back to quite recently, you read studies that are clearly written from the perspective of people expecting differences between the sexes, searching for them wherever they may find them, coming from the which is the worst way to do science. You come from an expectation and then you go and search for it. You should, in dreamland, come with objectivity and be excited about whatever result you get. So it's so important, in the same way that Sebastian is reading texts from colonials hoping to be Vikings on Science Versus. We're absolutely looking at studies and being like, what is going on here, So I think when we look at studies, where we're really looking for quality, basically, which is a term that some people kind of bristle at a little, but there are very well accepted rules around what makes a study that you can really trust, and a study that is perhaps one that maybe helps us understand, because to do a really good quality study, where, as you mentioned with the heart medication example, where you have a lot of people, you're randomizing properly, you're blinding properly, that is all very expensive, and often will need some kind of funding source. And in a dream world, that funding source would be from our taxes, or from the heavens above. But often it comes from pharmaceutical companies. And then so when we're analyzing studies, we're considering all of these factors. Yes, this is a good quality study, but it's funded by the big pharma. What do we do with that? Compare that to a study that was maybe not even randomized, but it was done at Harvard, but it's an observational study. So we're constantly just like looking at all of it's like a chess piece, and all the different players on it, a chess board. But I think when on the show, what you're really looking for is a body of evidence. So we will rarely make an episode, unless, I guess, ASMR is a funny example because the research is so new. And then I don't know how many times we would have said that on the show, preliminary evidence, just one study, it's very intriguing, but we'll see what happens. Ideally, what you'd want to see is, many studies, many different kinds of studies of different qualities, all leading to the same general outcome. And so because of that, on the show, we very rarely, we are revisiting episodes now, and we'll keep an eye out on them to see whether the science is changing. But there's been very few examples when we have reported on something where the science changes so dramatically, because when you're looking at a body of evidence, even if one study comes out that's like shows something different to what you reported on, you're like, well, there's still 200 others suggesting this. So if the science is changing very slowly, it may be. And like when I'm here in 100 years still making Science Versus, we'll report on that.
Revise.
Exactly. exactly. But when you feel good about a body of evidence, you often don't have to change it. But a classic example is, of course, the masks for COVID, the one that everyone loves to whip out, either as an example of how people don't understand science and no one got it wrong, we just didn't know, or an example of how you can't trust science, which is
another one.
Exactly.
How
But
about you?
that was an example where we reported on the masks and then we did an update.
Exactly.
You know what? It's remarkably similar, right? The parallels are huge, right? And here's the thing: like what I do on the podcast isn't what a true academic historian does, and I try to make that as clear as I can on the show, that I am someone that is evaluating the work of the real pros. Right. And, having done my master's in something called public history, I did get a taste of like the real work of a historian, which is going to the archives, rounding up all the primary documents that are related to a topic as you possibly can find, going through them yourself and evaluating them, while also being in conversation with this wider world of literature that, of course, you are read up on because you're a pro. What I'm doing on the podcast is I am reading those people's books, right? Like I am going to the work that is the best reviewed, that has been peer reviewed, that is sort of understood as sort of the most recent and most definitive look at a topic. And I start there. And then you go, okay, what stuff are they drawing on? I look at their footnotes, right? I kind of go into their sort of research process. I read a handful of other books and see if they are in any way conflicting with each other. If they are, I present both viewpoints on the podcast where I'm like, this person tells us this. However, this other historian who is just as trustworthy is telling us this about that. It's not that one is lying. It's just that they essentially looked at the same evidence and drew slightly different conclusions, right?
Which is interesting. Which is so interesting. Like there's a beauty in that, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so, what I'm doing but here's what I do on the show. This is when I get to kind of feel like I'm a real smarty pants, is when I evaluate the stuff that is written by people who are known to be pseudo historians or just peddlers of bullshit, for lack of a better term. I don't know if I can swear on your show. Sorry, I just went for it.
I think you can do it.
You can beep it out if need be. In those books, I come at them extremely skeptically. So whereas I have a certain amount of goodwill for something that's been peer reviewed, that doesn't mean you should just trust it implicitly, by the way. It means that you should be testing it off other things. You should be like, at the very least, doing the preliminary check of like, have other people, other historians, other academics challenged the conclusions of this book in any way. And also I use JSTOR. I'm using which is the online database of academic articles. So you're looking at like, when this came out, what were the academic reviews of this thing? Were they critical? Were they largely like, oh yeah, this is worthwhile? And often they will be. But okay, sorry, I got off track there. You're reading something by a Graham Hancock, if you know Graham Hancock. If you don't know Graham Hancock, he's often a guest on our buddy Joe Rogan's
It's pronounced
podcast.
Graham Hancock.
Oh yes, Hancock. Very very good. Anyway, he's got this belief, or he calls it a hypothesis, that there was this super ancient, super advanced global civilization, kind of an Atlantis-like civilization that existed before the last ice age and spawned all the other great civilizations of antiquity. And he's been, peddling this since the 1990s.
He's not referring to cockroaches, is he?
What's that?
He's not referring to cockroaches, is he?
No. He's referring to a civilization truly grander than the ancient Egyptians, right? Like, something like that. So when you dive into one of his books, I come at it extremely skeptically. I'm like ready to evaluate every single claim that he makes. And when you do that, it's exhausting because very quickly you find that, like, man, almost everything this guy says is nonsense. Or he'll do this thing where he will sort of hit you with all of these completely reasonable claims, completely verifiable stuff, but what about this? And then ask the question.
Yes, it's the trick of the charlatan. It
really is.
It's a playbook, and they go for it, and it's very convincing until you're like, what? No.
Yeah. Well, when you know that it can be exhausting for the debunker, right? This is why it's such an effective trick, right? If you are someone that is approaching their work skeptically, they will just hit you with like fact, real fact, fake, real fact, fake, odd question, right? Like, and so you then, if you're gonna properly, pull it apart, you have to go like, okay, this one, sure, this one, sure, this one, not really. Now, the debunking is rhetorically boring. You lose the audience often when trying to sort of sort the wheat from the chaff with this kind of stuff. Now, I think with my podcast, people are willing to kind of come for the ride. And I often don't want to dive into those types of writers because it's exhausting for me. However, I do it occasionally because it's instructive, right? And Wendy, clearly you've been down this road too.
Oh my God. My producer, Rose Rimler, gave me the name for this strategy. It's called the Gish Gallop.
The Gish Gallop. Yes, it is.
It's right. It's after a debater who used to debate about how he just didn't believe in evolution, and he would just be like, blah, 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 and so you couldn't stop them all. So it's a Gish Gallop. It's such a common tactic. It has a name.
And you see it all the time. You see it more and more, especially in political conversation now. It's exhausting. It is disingenuous. It is the ultimate bad faith form of argumentation. I'm kind of allergic to it personally. And so,
his name was Duane Gish.
He
worked for the Duane Gish. And he worked for the Institute for Creation Research. And
his name wasn't Gish Gallop. That would be quite amazing.
That would be.
And hold on.
I think.
I love this live fact.
I think if nothing else goes on my tombstone, it will say Eugenie C. Scott, coiner of the phrase Gish Gallop.
No.
Yes.
Is that true?
Wait.
Of course it is. It has to be.
Google it. And Google is always true, right?
You really coined the phrase the Gish Gallop?
Yeah.
Hold on. I've been sitting with my hero this entire time.
What? You've just been quietly watching us ramble on about this tactic. Wait, so off camera for the audience, because we were talking about the great charlatan Eugenie Scott, when you were like, it was coined by, I was like, wait, which Scott are we talking about here?
Oh, right.
Wow.
Well, I may have to actually I may have to just do this for our audience, just because it's just too good to pass up here.
Yeah.
This is the background. Eugenie Scott, mental scientist and spiritual healer.
Coiner of the term Gish Gallop.
Coiner.
Eugenie Scott it is.
That latter part is true. The mental scientist and spiritual healer is true of an earlier Eugenie Scott from around the turn of the century, who apparently practiced on 220, what's the name of that street? Anyway, there's a street there in the fine city of Rock City, Illinois. And this is from the Rock City Herald, or some, newspaper that was down there. Yes, it's, or that's just what those conspiracy people want you to believe. But anyway, that is a favorite skeptic backdrop of mine, but I didn't want to put it up today because I thought it would be distracting from our discussion. But since it's come up.
No, okay. I mean, well, Eugenie, my mind's a little blown because, actually describing that term, I think, has been incredibly helpful for those of us who encounter it, right?
Well, it was coined in an article that I wrote back in the 90s. I think that the title of the argument was Debates on the Globetrotters. And I wrote an article about why scientists should not debate creationists. And one reason is because, debate is a sport. It is not a proper exchange of information, or certainly the way scientists or historians, any scholar, actually determine conclusions. It's a sport. You have a person on one side, a person on the other side. And what creationists are famous for doing, and Duane Gish, bless his heart, was just the master of this, is just peppering the opponent with one incorrect statement about evolution after another. The amount of meteoritic dust on the moon disproves evolution. The failure of natural selection to explain body plans destroys evolution. The Cambrian explosion timeframe destroys evolution. Polonium halos destroys evolution. And
Is it too big?
when it's the time for the poor old evolutionists to get up there and talk, here's the skinny on polonium halos. Just like you were saying, Sebastian, it's really boring to go through all those isotopes, right? So why this is a bullshit comment?
Yeah.
So a bogus comment. And here's why the Cambrian explosion is not evidence against evolution. But then you run out of time. And so what happens is the person watching the debate says, well, I guess Dr. Gish was wrong about the Cambrian explosion and polonium halos, but he must have been right about the failure of natural selection and the meteoritic dust on the moon, because those weren't answered. And because of the Gish-Gallup, there's no way you can answer all of the claims that a pseudoscience or some other charlatan will produce in a debate situation. So yes, that was honestly done.
Yeah.
Anyway, I digress. My friends, we have had so much fun. I wish we could do a 2-hour program on this. Maybe we should just keep talking, and we'll cut it in half and do one in November and one in October. But I'm sure we can't really keep it that long. But you have warmed my chilly old heart, because everything that I thought would happen on this to reinforce my belief that science and history done well have so many overlaps in terms of their methodology, and so many parallels in how we as scientists or we as historians come up with conclusions about the phenomena we're trying to explain. And I think both of you did a splendid job in helping to prove my point. So I would like each of you to give a little pitch, if you will, for your respective podcasts. Tell people how they can find out more about it. And I've already spoken a great deal about why everybody should be listening to both of your podcasts, but you go ahead and make a pitch yourself too. Wendy, tell us about Science Versus.
Oh, if by now you're sick of my voice, well, you should go listen. It's called Science Versus, Science VS. It's available on all platforms, but the back catalog, if you want to listen to the CD Adventures or the ivermectin episode, it's only on Spotify. It's just, if you want to know more about the show, we have our if you listen and you're like, I'm not sure about this, which is a wonderful thing to think. You don't need to trust everything, but we have a transcribed a script that's fully transcribed. So all of our citations, everything that we've read, so you can know why we think things. And it's, there's often like more than 100 citations. So go check it out.
The references and footnotes are outstanding. It's really true. Sebastian, tell us why everybody should be listening to Our Fake History.
Well, hopefully because it's fun to listen to Our Fake History.
It is fun.
And
you're fun.
Yeah. So you can find Our Fake History absolutely anywhere you get your podcasts. If you're curious about what sources I'm using for the show, go to ourfakehistory.com and you just click on the page for the specific episode. All the episodes are there as well. And you can see a work cited that I've used. And also you can see all the episode art. I've got an amazing artist that creates completely unique art for every single show. And so if you want to engage with the visual side of the podcast, ourfakehistory.com is a good place to do it.
And they can support you as well, can't they?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, you know what? I don't. I want people to listen to the show first before they decide they're going to give me money. So go and listen to it. And if you like it and you want to support the show, the best way is through Patreon. So you can go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory. And I'm just about to put out a brand new extra episode for all my patrons. I've been working on it today. It's on the lost city of El Dorado.
Oh, great.
Yeah, but that's just for the patrons. So if that sounds
Value
exciting
added.
to you, check it out.
Absolutely. Wendy, do you have anything comparable in terms of the support for Science Versus, or you get somebody can grant money your way?
We're supported by Spotify, so
very good.
Yes, so
that makes life simpler. Good for them. My friends, I hope you're friends at this point. I think spending this hour with you has just been wonderful. I've really enjoyed this tremendously. And I thank you very much for joining us on Bay Area Skeptics. And I will look forward to continuing to listen to both of your podcasts and encourage those of you listening to this program to check these podcasts out. I think you'll find them as interesting as I do. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Unfortunately, it is my duty to explain to you why we do not have a question and answer period after tonight's Skep Talk. Both of our wonderful guests had other commitments for tonight. We had to tape this program early because Wendy, for example, was not sure what time zone she was going to be in on the 13th of October. So we will have to dispense with our usual question and answer period, for which I apologize. But I hope the rest of the program was interesting enough that you were glad that you are here. I want to tell you a little bit about the November Skep Talk, because I think it's something that you're going to find very interesting. Now, you use the internet, I can guess, and you probably are very good at separating the wheat from the chaff on the internet, because there's a lot of chaff. There's a lot of pretty dumb stuff on the internet, but there's also a lot of really great stuff on the internet, like us. And so how do you I'm sure have developed the skills to tell them apart. But what about kids? What about students? How can the science education community help students to become more critical social media and internet users? Our guest for next month, Dr. Jonathan Osborne from Stanford University, a internationally famous science educator, will bring us some ideas on what the science education community has been thinking about in ways of helping students learn how to be critical users of the internet. His talk will be Science Education in an Age of Misinformation, and it will be at the usual second Thursday of the month, this time November 10th, 8:30 p.m. at the bit.ly that you will see on the illustration. Come join us. I look forward to seeing you there.